Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the third international conference, Why Still Education? Humanism, Posthumanism, Anti-Humanism, Educational Perspectives. Today we have a session starting with Antonio Pinilla and his presentation, The Who, How and Why of Cosmological Education in Eugen Fink. For each presentation we have 20 minutes, and after that 10 to 15 minutes for the discussion, comments, maybe your interventions. So I kindly ask Antonio to start.
Thank you. And should I move this a little bit? There. Okay. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy and honored to open this session. So the title of my presentation is The Who, How and Why of a Cosmological Education in Eugen Fink. Let me start by saying that the premise of the conference that gathers us is precisely that the present situation of our human and educational history requires rethinking a number of important questions in education. Living in times in which world events have so clearly evidenced the fragility and the illusory stability at the core of our grasp of education, its subjects, means, and goals, the name of this venue, Why Still Education, is very apt because the organizers have been very clever not to add a question mark. So it can refer both to a radical commitment, there is something that makes education still relevant or important or necessary, and to the questions, right? What is it that makes education still matter? What can justify such a commitment? What do we mean by education? For whom is this education that still matters or that still concerns us? What is that education does to be so important? What if our commitment is to be something else than a mere assumption, and then, for instance, become a new beginning for education in this situation? These are questions that need to be addressed. And the way that I propose to do it is through the examination of the philosophy of this man, Eugen Fink, a thinker that precisely conceived of the determinations or that thought of our relationship with the world as fundamentally questionable and likewise open to new possibilities. Eugen Fink was a German philosopher that is mostly known as the assistant of Edmund Husserl and a collaborator of Martin Heidegger. Collaborator sounds not so good when you mix it with Heidegger, but then a colleague, a student, and a professor in university. And he was also one of the main scholars working at the intersection of phenomenology and philosophy of education in the context of 20th century Germany, with others like Gunther Buck, Werner Locke, Heinrich Rombach, or Egon Schutz. They framed educational research in phenomenology as the study and theory of lived experience. So they examine education in relation to the configuration of meaning, right? That is the central sort of postulate of phenomenology. And that happens in the context of different horizons, of different experiences, memories, schemas, anticipations, and so on. In addition, and this is why I bring Fink to this conference, I think he's especially relevant because his philosophical thought relied on a deep critique of Western metaphysics and of its expression in humanist doctrine and education. So I will formulate 3 questions today. The first one is the question concerning the subject of education. Who is the subject of education? Who do we educate? Who educates? The second is the question concerning the enactment of the educational activity. So what happens when we educate? How does education happen? And the third one is why, then the one of the conference, why still education? And I will address each of these questions with concepts or operative concepts from Fink's philosophy of play, that was his other big theme, that are respectively, as I hope to show, the importance of these concepts, the one of ens cosmologicum, that is how he re-elaborates what the human is, right? So apropos humanism and so on, the one of symbol and freedom. I will try to argue then that when we pose these questions to Fink, we come up with an image of education that symbolically enacts the openness that grounds the freedom that characterizes our relationship to the world. And I hope this will become clearer at the end, this very complicated phrase. This is, in other words, what I mean by cosmological education, so an education that departs from our relationship to the world. Let's start with the first one. So who is the subject of education? To clarify the terms in which Fink formulates his work, I'll start by referring to the tradition that he found himself in. So this tradition is human science pedagogy. That was the leading, or the, let's say, the dominant philosophy of education in Germany since the 19th century, starting with the work of Schleiermacher and then Dilthey, right? And this tradition understands education in two ways, right? On the one hand, it is the embodied practices that take place in a context of a particular history and culture. And on the other, you have the education sciences, right? So when this tradition of allgemeine Pädagogik thinks about education, they're always thinking about the two aspects of education. So the practices and the scientific knowledge of those practices. The defining question in this tradition, as formulated by Schleiermacher, is a generational question. What do we, the older generation, want with the younger, right? So they don't start from, let's say, the family or the classroom or the school in their examination of education, but they start from this cyclical nature of human existence, that we're constantly divided in sort of older and younger generations. And then education is what happens when that intergenerational confrontation takes place, right? Fink says it in the following way: education is found wherever a difference between the generations exist, where those who are older feel responsible for the younger, right? And then here there was something that Rosi Braidotti brought up yesterday, who is the we then, and what is responsibility in this sense. So I hope to address this throughout the presentation. However, Fink did not only reproduce what was this tradition, but he was part of a very particular generation of German scholars that were working after World War II. So they were a generation of scholars that could not just share the same assumptions of the older generation, because look where that brought them, right? So Fink, as for example Otto Bollnow, they rejected previous theories of education that affirmed the child's natural growth, a la Rousseau, for example, or that even also saw the role of the educator as more of a trainer or a mentor, like in Kant, right? Because all of them, they propose a sort of basic human development that is followed by every child, or that needs to be sort of assisted by every teacher. Fink, also like Klaus Mollenhauer, another one of these scholars, they said that this tradition did not fully account for the reality of education, right? Because so the question of Schleiermacher is the we is the older generation directed to the children, but then they say, of course, this is a reciprocally formative relationship. It's not only how the older generation forms the younger, but then how the younger generation affects back the older. And he takes it, let's say, one step beyond, and his project then consists of not of critiquing any form of adult-centered or child-centered education, and propose something that is a world-centered education, right? So an education that is concerned with the world. What does that mean? And what type of education is that? Sorry, I'm still there. He elaborates this in a text called "The Questionableness of the Modern Educator," right? And in that text, where Fink asks about the essence of education, or just what is it that defines education, he says, any consideration of the human being, any consideration of education needs to start from a consideration of the human being. Reflection, I quote, the reflection on the nature of the educator is always necessarily a reflection on human being itself. And I think that's also a premise that we share in this conference. If we're going to ask about education, we need to ask about the human being. So when Fink uses this methodological approach, he points out that there have been some dominant ways in which the human has been understood in different theories of education. He refers specifically to three theories: the one of erudition, one of naturalization, one of enlightenment. I won't elaborate on his critique of these theories, but then he's basically referring to a sort of an education that centers labor and work. So that is the erudition that is bringing out of the rough, right? So education is something that we work on the students as if they were works of art, and then we want to polish them, so to say, right? Naturalization is, again, Rousseau and the idea of the noble savage, right? So or more contemporarily speaking, the idea of non-directive education, right? So let the child sort of develop their own skills, develop their own interests, and so on. And then enlightenment is, again, Kant with the idea of maturity and the idea of autonomy, of bringing the student, sort of tutoring the student into autonomy. So what he finds in all of these different notions is that they have, they posit permanent components with regards to human nature, right? And then these components of human nature are what gives us the expected results in education, right? So if we think of the human in a way, then we want education to be something else with regards to that. So instead of assuming instead of becoming an advocate for any of these possibilities, what Fink highlights here is that they point to the fundamental questionableness with regards to the being of the human, right? That we have so many different interpretations of education, of humanity, and so on. So humans end up being sort of the biggest riddle and the strangest of all creatures because we are deeply irresolute. We are a question for ourselves. And this is where education should begin, for Fink, in this riddle that we are. Because this riddle is what humanism or Western metaphysics has tried to eliminate, right? So the conception of the metaphysical interpretation of the human as a son, logon, echon, right, as a living being that has reason, is something that has made us sort of split in half, right? We have an animal side, we have a more divine side, so a sensuous side, an intellectual side, right? And he says, well, this is the notion that fundamentally bases humanist education, right? The problem with this, again, is that it limits what we can be, right? Human beings here are understood as possessing an entitative essence, something that he calls an entitative essence, that is as if our essence was something that we can hold, right, and say, this is what we are, right? And the problem, he says, is that we cannot do that. And we're constantly asking what we are, right? So this position fails to grasp what is distinctively human, and that is that we are imperfect beings, right? So if humanism that humanism, not even humanism or not even this metaphysical interpretation of the human being can decide what we are. We are constantly troubled by this question concerning ourselves, right? And ourselves particularly in relation to the world, right? We are, or what he says is that we experience existence as something enigmatic, problematic. We say, how is the world, how is it even a possibility that everything is, right? And this is the defining characteristic of this ens cosmologicum, of this world being that we are, that we can question our own being and the being of the world, right? So what makes us human and what makes us, or what creates the need for education, is not that we give shape to the world, right? So it's not a model of productivity, but it is instead that we can relate with meaning to the world. The human is not this centaur trapped in between earth and heaven, but we sort of inhabit this in-between with meaning, and we can question that in-between, and from that in-between we can relate to the world, right? Unlike animals, he says, our being is not fixed, and unlike God, we're not perfect, complete beings, right? So education is what firstly enables us to realize our own being, right, and make ourselves, and make a task out of our own existence. It does not merely concern, however, the self-realization of the individual, but it is first made possible in the common world that we share. Right? This common world is what allows the experience and expresses the pedagogical meaning of the difference between generations. Education then is the sort of medium that renews ourselves and the world. The second question, and I'll go to the second question, what does education do? If we're educating for the ens cosmologicum, right, so if education departs from this understanding of us as a question, as a subject to multiple interpretations, how is it that we express this in education? So Fink did not address this question explicitly, but some others in his generation did. For example, Klaus Mollenhauer distinguished two forms of this intergenerational encounter. So Mollenhauer says, education can happen in two ways. The first one is as a presentation. When we say that it is a presentation, we refer to the embodied words, habits, and actions that adults present to children, right? Exemplifying a way of life and say, this is how life is. But then there's another one that is representation, and that refers to the splitting of our experience that makes education an indirect way of accessing the world, right? So when we think of, for example, the school and the objects that are typical of the school, so the blackboard, the books, the computers, or the infamous LMS, all of those things sort of split the world, right? And make us relate to the world. So here in this presentation, I'm mostly interested in the second form of this educational encounter, right? Because I believe that there is where education can do something to renew the world, right? Because Fink says, the teacher exists in a representative way for fellow human beings, right? So teachers are different from parents, and this is something that is, for example, also in Freire in his beautiful letters to those who dare to teach, right? Freire also says, the discourses that equate teachers and parents are trying to tame education, no? Because then you're giving sort of responsibilities to the teachers that do not belong to them. So what is it that the teacher does? And if you're a teacher of the ens cosmologicum, right? What do? We cannot, as teachers, fall back on presentations of or we cannot fall back on assumptions about what the world is, right? Because then we would be falling back on a certain notion of stability about the self-understanding of the world, or we would naively assume that the new generation will not change that world. So if we fall back on the first form, the presentation, we would ignore that our relationship to the world is firstly not predetermined by necessity, right? So when we relate to the things of the world, they are not just things that are, but that can become something else. The first form assumes the being of the world, while the second remains open to the phenomenality of the world and to its becoming, right? So when teachers represent the world for students, then they are inviting the notion of the becoming of the world, right? So becoming something becoming something that it is not. The concept that is operating here is that of symbol, right? And symbol is a concept that Fink brings from his philosophy and I'm going to run, of his philosophy of play. What happens when children play, especially symbolic play? So I have a picture here of my little cousin playing with my grandma's old writing machine, right? When children play, the things that they play with symbolize the world, symbolize something. They become a fragment that reunites a world of meaning, right? So when when we create a play world, or when we play with toys, with playthings, we relate to actual things, but those actual things are not trapped in their necessity, right? So this typewriter is not only a typewriter, but it becomes drums or something else, right? A stick is not only a stick, but it becomes the sword of a knight or whatnot, right? So when we play together, play transcends the being of the world in a symbolic enactment, right? So through play, we can experience the becoming of the world, the becoming of meaning, how things come to be, right? Because when we play, we basically create a play world, right? And then how that disappears. A similar thing happens in education for think. Because in education, when something is brought to, for example, the classroom, that thing is not trapped in its necessity, right? So when we bring something of biology, of mathematics, or whatnot to the classroom, that is not, we don't bring that to students only for them to replicate what that already does in the world, but we bring it so they can turn around what they are, like in play, right? So the education thing, that is, it could be anything that we bring to this encounter, is what mediates our questionable relationship with the world, right? That, and here I'm trying to make an emphasis not only on the knowledge, but on the things that are in the classroom, right? Because through those things is that we reconstitute the meaning of the world. I will skip this and then just come to the last part. This means to the last part here. No, and then I'll say the last thing in 1 minute. If you can go back. And I just want to point out to this last thing. Education has a fundamental moment of irreality, right? That is not something very common to say, because it's usually the same usually goes. We educate for life, not for school, no? And then if a school does something, it's to prepare children for life. But I want to resist this, because we need to maintain that moment of magic, of irreality, because that is where meaning can change, right? And usually what we have, for example, in our neoliberal times, is that when we have people saying education should teach for life, what life is already pre-decided, right? So it becomes a reproduction of hegemonic values that are superimposed on educational goals, right? So it basically just serves the reproduction of the current social order. That's why the sad face is also there next to that saying. Finally, and in 1 minute, I will address, yes, in 1 minute, I will say something about the last slide. Why still education? Here the idea is that education, if we think of it from a cosmological perspective, becomes a praxis of and for our worldly freedom, right? Education is precisely the moment that defines what the world is. And this is why I added here the pictures from Chile a couple years ago, and from more recently Iran, that of these moments of social explosion that have been started by school students. And I think that is very relevant that it was school students that have sort of led this protest in Chile, that it started with girls coming out of protesting in schools and against the rise in transportation tariff, and it ended up it's ending up in a new constitution with a new government and so on. In Iran, something very similar is happening. So in education, students, teachers have the opportunity of working as mediators in this co-constitution of the world, and students made foreigners in this artificial setting of education, they can also renew what the world is. Then education is a matter of deliberation, that is, of liberating the world, liberating what the world is, and then of counseling on what it should be. Education is, at the end of the day, a new beginning. And I had something else prepared about the new beginnings in posthumanism, but then I'll leave that for another time. Yes. Thank you.
thank you very much. So our next speaker is Geraldine McDermott Dalton, if I spelled that correctly. Geraldine, okay. Multimodality of learning as a posthuman opening in higher education practices, screencast design and development in lectures.
It's always interesting to see what it looks like on the big screen as well, you know, when you're looking at the small screen all the time. Okay, hi everybody. My name is Geraldine McDermott Dalton, that's my husband, that's his token. And I suppose today what I wanted to talk to you about was the subject of my PhD research, which is around multimodality. And I have to admit straight away I have stumbled into posthumanism, and it's Natasha's fault. But the idea really, I didn't start out with a posthumanist approach, so you know I will add that disclaimer. But it seems to, just from what I've heard yesterday and even this morning, it seems to fit to a certain extent the kinds of things that I've been thinking about. So I'm really delighted to be here and hoping to learn an awful lot more about posthumanism. And I thought it was very brave of one of the conference attendees this morning to say, I'm the only humanist in the room. You know, because when you say that at a conference about posthumanism, you're thinking, wow, that's brave. But I could also potentially be another humanist. So anyway, if we just move on, I'll give you my background. And it's important to contextualize the study purely because if I'm talking about this particular piece of research, it's really around technology. And a lot of my professional life has been working with technology, helping people to use technology, teaching with technology, teaching students how to use technology. So it really is that messy assemblage of, you know, the human and the digital. And I think, you know, when we talk about those digital practices, that's something that really has been part and parcel of my professional context over the past 15, 18 odd years. So now I did work in learning and teaching department, and I worked a lot with staff in that context, and now I work in a faculty that focuses in online education. So you can see that I'm there for a while again, you know, in terms of the technology piece. And the other thing then, I suppose, as well, is that I put the map of Ireland up. Usually I just put the map of Ireland, but we're very far away from Ireland at the moment, so I thought I'd situate it in the wider context as well. And you can see that we're smack bang in the middle, and we've recently become a technological university. And that's also significant because of the technology piece as well. So it is embedded in the practices of what we do. And I was interested yesterday, both in Rosie's speech and then this morning what Carol was saying about that entanglement of digital and the material and then the human as well. So if we just move on to give you the research context of this particular study, this is a contested acronym, TEL, Technology Enhanced Learning. I'm a student of a PhD program in Technology Enhanced Learning, and just Natasha is my supervisor as well, I suppose I better say that, Natasha. But the idea is this contested term about technology enhancing learning, you know, so you have the learning, technology is going to make it better than that, and I know there have been lots and lots of discussions about it. But for purpose really here in terms of the research, that we're looking at higher education lecturers, so I'll just move on through, yeah. Higher education lecturers who are working in a variety of disciplines, so science, engineering, we have business as well, but also that academic support piece. Those are the lecturers who were involved in my study, so hopefully you kind of see a broad range of disciplines represented. And as well as that then, they've completed CPD, their continuing professional development. It's in technology enhanced learning, it's level 9 postgraduate, so they have subscribed to a particular program and set of learning outcomes and all of the things that Carol talked about this morning in terms of the structures that we are involved in. And I'm going to give you the learning outcome for the assessment piece that was the screencast, which is the subject of mine, and it is a bit of a mouthful. Okay, so any of you who've known about learning outcomes, that's the learning outcome for which the assessment was the screencast or the instructional video, which is the subject of the PhD study. So as you can see, it's multimedia. It's looking at different principles that guide us, so instructional design principles, It's probably not there, but we had universal design principles because at the moment accessibility is quite important in the Irish higher education context. But as well as that, it's looking for particular pedagogical purposes. So we asked the lecturers involved, and I co-facilitated this module, we asked them to think about a muddy point, kind of a difficult teaching moment, and to design an instructional video about this. And this was before COVID, just to let you know, okay? So if you remember back in COVID, the asynchronous video was the lifesaver for a lot of people, but this was before COVID, so I'd like to say we were ahead of the curve a little bit, but anyway. So if we move on, this is something that guided us when we were teaching that module, because we were very mindful not to be techno-deterministic. So not to be all about the technology. Here's a shiny new toy, we're going to use this, we'll fit it in somewhere and we'll find some kind of a use for it. So we were very clear about the pedagogy first. And I've since come kind of full circle to go, well, there's a dichotomy there, isn't there? You know, there you go, there's your black and white, there's your pedagogy or technology, or pedagogy first and then technology, but it's not like that. It's so enmeshed in everything we do that now we're kind of saying, well, you know, which comes first? Is it the chicken or the egg? Which is influencing the other, which is enabling the other, and how is then technology embodied or enacted in that particular environment? So moving on to the screencast then, and in terms of, I suppose, what that multimodal screencast includes, and those are the kind of the four key areas. And just to be clear, I use the term screencast, but you've all used the instructional videos, so you know what I'm talking about. You know, you'll find them on YouTube. Have any of you created them yourselves? Yeah, yeah. So there you go, exactly. So when you're creating a screencast, you have generally a very specific cohort of students in mind with a particular objective, whether it's pedagogical, whether it's skills-based and so on. But you know that there is, generally speaking, a visual element to it. There is you, your narration, or somebody's narration. There may be music in the background if you're that way inclined. And then what I've put in there as well, and I suppose this is why I kind of started to think about the, again, the socio-materiality of the digital practices. What affordances are there in the software that we almost take for granted, kind of like the buildings that Carl was talking about this morning. They're there, they serve as a backdrop, and they enable us to do things. But what I found was that these were things that actually were driving the design of the screencast. So looking at things like that, we had the visual, and you'll see in a moment there's a framework that I developed, and instead of talking about images or photographs, I pulled everything in that was a visual representation of a concept. And I'll mention the concept in a minute, but the idea was that it wasn't just a photograph, it wasn't just an image, it wasn't just a graph or a chart or something, it was that graphic pictorial representation of the concept. In the context of the linguistic mode, the idea there was to focus on the language of the discipline. So if you can think about your discipline, is the vocabulary that you use, that your students actually learn, or I suppose by osmosis kind of absorb over the period of their program. And I wanted to see where was that embedded in the screencast, and how was that then a representation of the concept that was being taught. And I'm delighted to see that we were talking about relational approaches and that, and relational pedagogy. And I wanted to see as well, because we're very proud of the idea we have a great connection with students, you know, we have a great relationship with our students, we look after our students, we're quite a small university, so there are only about 4,000, at the moment, 4,000 on our campus, only 4,000 students. Altogether, on the distributed campus, we have about 15,000 students, I think. So in terms of the size of the university, we pride ourselves on that kind of relationship with our students. But I wanted to see how that relational approach then was enacted or embodied within the screencast. So that was kind of another focus. And then following on from that, we had the kind of the audio. And for me, the audio there were two elements to it. The first one was the voice. So you know your teacher voice. I don't know if you have children, but my children say to me, don't put your teacher voice on. So it's that teaching voice, and it's the tempo, the tone, it's those prosodic features that you know, if you want to emphasize something, you will intonate. Okay, this is important. Take this down. So those features then, how are they enacted, or how are they embodied in the screencast? And then the other thing, and I found it in some of the screencasts, was music. Music was included as well. So what was the purpose of music? Was there to develop an emotional connection? Was it really to link the concept with an experience? What was that idea around the music as well? And that was to explore that bit. And then, as I say, the software affordances. And this one was grounded in what I mentioned earlier on, things like instructional design principles. So Meyer and his multimedia principles, the students were introduced to those during the module, and then as dutiful students, they recited them back. But what I wanted to see was there evidence of those multimedia principles in the screencast, and how did that affect things like where things were positioned on the screen? You know, if we're looking at spatial sequencing, how many of you use PowerPoint and use animation in PowerPoint to scaffold the instruction or to scaffold the information? So what kind of features were there as well, and how were they embodied in the screencast? So that's the multimodal screencast. And I suppose, just to give you a visual of it, if we move on to the next slide, what I did was, just for the purpose of the analysis, I pulled apart a screencast. So that's a screencast, what you see in the background. And I pulled it apart. And I don't know, what are your first impressions? A lot of text, a lot of visual, a bit of everything? Do you think about it? This one is about microbial bioplastics. So for the scientists in the room, I learned a lot, definitely. And the idea here is that there's a combination of multiple modes, okay? So you can see that it starts with some visual, there's quite a lot of text, but there's also all of this down at the bottom was a video that was pulled from an external source and then put in to reinforce the concept that was being taught. So that's, I suppose, that visual composition of the multimodal screencast, just to give you a sense of what they looked like. And in terms of the study itself, when I was collecting data, I was kind of focused on the screencasts, but I wasn't just going to analyse it myself, you know, maybe looking at particular frameworks. I wanted to talk to the creators. I wanted to talk to the lecturer designers, those who were actually, I suppose, involved in the production of the screencast, involved in the design of the screencast, because I wanted to get under the bonnet, that idea of finding out, why did you put that there? What's the purpose of that? What was your thinking of this? Was there epistemological kind of concerns or ideas in terms of your design? Excuse me. And then I wanted to see how they brought it all together in terms of that composition. So I looked at the multimodal screencasts, but I also did interviews, and there were 3 parts to it. And the first part of the interview was finding about that sociocultural context. The idea that we don't create in a vacuum. We don't teach in a vacuum. We bring all of the knowledge of our sociocultural context to bear in terms of our teaching. So you can't say, for example, well, you know, this is why I do this. It's because I like it. It's because, you know, you have a whole culture behind you in terms of the kinds of things that you value and the beliefs that you have and so on. The second part of the interview was around that knowledge development. So when I was looking at a concept, what I wanted to find out was, do the lecturers consider these concepts as threshold concepts for their disciplines, or are they core concepts? If they're threshold concepts, what is the screencast representing? Is it transformative knowledge? Is it troublesome knowledge? Is it that liminal space, that muddy point, that difficult element of the discipline? Is that what they're representing in the screencast? But I wanted to find it out from the lecturers themselves. So that was that part of the interview. And the final part of the interview then was around an inquiry graphics analysis. And using Natasha's framework, it was to inquire the screencast, to find out, I suppose, in the context of looking at developing students' knowledge of a particular disciplinary concept, what were the key elements for the lecturers? What were the key moments of learning? And then how would they deconstruct or unpack the screencast in terms of that knowledge development? So the framework then was used in the interview with the participants, and then that led to the next phase, which was looking at a multimodal inquiry framework, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What I was also interested in was this idea of the semiotic weighting of modes, and I suppose the research itself is grounded in semiotics, grounded in edusemiotics in particular, and multimodality. But again, I'm coming from, I suppose, at the point of view of looking at science, the meaning of science, and the situatedness of science. So things like, you know, I'm in science. Is language the main mode for kind of discourse in terms representing knowledge. We talk about the creative arts. So visual is very important for the creative arts. And in the context of the disciplines, I wanted to see, well, which one was the major carrier of meaning, or was there a minor carrier of meaning, or were they equally dispersed throughout the screencasts? So I looked at the modal density of each of those, the modes within the screencasts, and then to see, which one, as I say, was major or minor carrier of meaning. And if we move on just to the next slide to see, I suppose, why I use inquiry graphics. It really was to just slow things down a little bit. And I think with technology, everything changes so fast that we get into that whole culture of moving to the next thing. Well, this is a better tool, or this is a better way of doing it. And the idea of the inquiry graphics was just to pause and really unpack what was there in front of us in terms of the screencasts, and giving the lecturers an opportunity to sit back and go, okay, from a critical stance, what have I put together here? Is this the intended meaning that I wanted to communicate to my students? And is this, I suppose, the idea of reflecting on the images that we produce and what we produce them for. So that inquiry graphics framework allowed the lecturers to investigate what they thought of their own cognition in terms of the screencasts themselves. But I wasn't just focusing on the visual. I wanted to move it on and then look at all of the other modes that were in the screencast. And that's why I moved to multimodality. And I suppose the key things for me really were around looking at communication as more than language, more than visual, more than sound, more than touch. It is that interconnectedness of modes. You have a number of those transmodal moments, how the meaning is translated into different modes. But it's for us to look at it in the context of our logocentric traditions, okay? I still have the text on my slides, the PhD still has to be written, unfortunately, but it's looking at that really, that logocentric approach where language is the dominant mode for knowledge transmission or knowledge dissemination. And this challenges that, because I suppose in the world that we live in, which is a hypervisual world, we're so used to so many different modes and so used to them in our normal lives that education is only catching up, I feel. But the idea here is looking at different modes of communication, going beyond language, and then looking at the affordances of each of those modes in the context of knowledge development or teaching concepts within a discipline. So bringing it into the post-human approach, I think the idea here really is to challenge that logocentric approach, challenge the traditionality, and then look at how we can move this education, learning and teaching, move it along so that we look at different representations of the concept, and that we have a much more visual, much more multimodal experience for our students, where we bring what they do in their normal lives into education. But not only that, we do it in a way that develops their own critical media literacy, the concept of critical graphicacy, where you look at images and you inquire those images. So you don't consume, but that you inquire with a critical perspective. And I don't know about in your universities, but certainly for us, criticality is very important, I suppose, in terms of these new skills, when you're developing programs. Critical thinking, critical literacy, and I suppose critical media literacy is something particularly in a world that is saturated with media. It's something that we really do need to focus on. So that was kind of bringing it along from that point of view. And this is the framework that I proposed. It is a little bit complicated, I suppose, initially, but if I break it down and go to the next slide, and we'll just look at one layer at a time. So initially we're looking at the first layer, which is the multimodal ensemble, okay? And it is taking in those 4 modes. Now, equally, if you're looking at a multimodal ensemble, I don't know if you keep your webcams on if you're teaching online. I can see that I use gesture a lot, okay? So equally, you could have gesture in there as a mode. But the idea is to examine or explore the affordances of each of those different things and see what opportunities there are, again, keeping that critical stance in mind, to inquire a particular sign, or in this case, screencast, with a particular research objective in mind. I've put the graphic pictorial and the linguistic together as the inquiry graphic sign. That was my starting point, and then I extended that for the multimodal inquiry framework. So things like relational language, the voice of teaching, I've mentioned the enactment of software, and then semiotic referencing, and naturally there's a spelling mistake, but anyway, we'll move on. But that's the first layer of the multimodal inquiry framework, looking at just the affordances, the individual affordances, but also you can see in terms of that symbol in the middle, the interconnectedness, okay? The second layer of the framework focuses on that inquiry, so that criticality, that critical thinking, critical inquiry, and unpacking the screencast to find out, well, is that what you wanted to say? Is that the meaning that was intended? And so on. And it builds on the inquiry graphics. And if you're not familiar with inquiry graphics, at the end I have Natasha's book, which is really useful from the point of view of understanding that approach, but it deconstructs. Oops, that's me finished, and I am nearly finished. The final one in the framework is layer 3, which is my research concept, or my research topic, which is around pedagogical approaches to teaching. It could equally be any research object. It could be social justice, it could be climate change, but it's using the framework to unpack the screencast in this case, or some other multimedia artifacts in terms of the teaching or the research object. And we're going to skip through a couple of different things. We'll stay going. These are just examples. They're of the different things. And I just want to finish with this one, okay? Why is this useful? This is new to me, as I say, but the idea of sociomateriality, the fact that we actually now have to engage with all of these technologies, the digital practices, as really as the material embodiment of our sociocultural practices, we can't just leave digital technologies to one side, okay? They are, as I say, completely meshed into what it is we do, and they do have an agentive nature. And one of the lecturers said to me, yeah, you know, I like Camtasia, but it won't let me do this. And when we hear those kind of things, or, you know, the system says no, to quote Little Britain, I don't know if any of you have ever come across it, those kind of things, when we hear those, then we give them a power, you know, that we're not necessarily aware of. So what I would think, maybe to finish on then, is looking for a rethinking of how we approach education, how we approach it with technology, and this is just one way maybe of looking at that. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And that's just a little picture from where I live in Ireland, you know. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. The third speaker, Patricia Gibson, is joining us online. We'll just wait a few seconds to just turn on the mic.
I'd like to hear a bit more about the last part of your lecture. Specifically, what do you mean by deliberation, and that the education is the matter of deliberation?
Can you hear me? Yes. So with that, I was pointing to the political nature of education, and to what happens when we have this educational encounter. So it basically refers to two things. This is rooted in things phenomenological education, right? So he was a phenomenologist, and in phenomenology there is a change in attitude when you do research, right? So we have the natural attitude, that is when we go about our own life just assuming that things are, and then you have the phenomenological attitude, that is when you bracket that, right? And you say, I don't assume that things are anymore just valid, right? But I question, or I don't assume that validity. And I think that's what happens for him, that's what happens in education as well. So when we bring something of the world to the classroom, let's say, we don't assume the necessary determinations of that thing. So, for example, in the case of technology, that I didn't get to talk about technology, but when we have a certain device in the classroom, right, we just don't follow along what it can or cannot let us do, but by bringing it to education, we liberate it from those determinations, right? So this has to do with the fact that when we educate, we constitute this sort of questioning communities in which nothing is for granted, in a way, right? So what we can or can't do is not previously decided, but then is decided in that question. So deliberation has two parts: that liberating, deliberation. Yes, so exactly. So it's the two things, right? So it's the liberating of things, of things when you bring them to the classroom, let's say, right? Or when you use screencast for you could say for work or for class, are there different uses that are enabled just because we're using it for education? And it's then also deliberating as counseling, no? In German, well, and the connection that Fink does, it's related to the German language, because deliberation is Beratung and counseling is Raten. So it has a deliberation, and counseling has the same etymological root, right? So when we counsel, when we deliberate, we can think of new goals, new possibilities, new becomings, and so on. So yes, and I think that is related to technical education as well. That is very important in matters of technical education, because then we don't reject that we need that technology is already a part of education, but then what technology, and what, when we bring it to the school, let's say, then it is not pre-decided what that can or cannot do, but it is decided in the process in that encounter. Yes, that's all. Was it clear? Yes, thank you for the question.
I wanted to ask a question to Antonio, also about bringing objects
Recording
to the
in
classroom.
progress.
So, Antonio, my question is quite simple, not very advanced in terms of philosophy, but a very practical example. If I bring cookies to the classroom, and, well, they disappear in the process of naturally disappear in the process of interaction with students. Am I deliberating something? Is it like multiplication of reality in the classroom? What is happening? Is it some special status of the object in the classroom? Because these cookies, actually, they are not instructional material. They are just not instructional objects. They are food. Yeah, maybe for encouragement, maybe just to feed the hungry kids. What is happening then?
That is a very good question, and those are things that I'm trying to think about right now, because definitely these people didn't think about this. No, the German philosophers, and I'm tempted to say that it depends what you bring the cookies for, no? So, because again, coming back to these different educational forms of presentational forms or representational forms, right? Are you bringing the cookie to eat? Or is the eating then, is the eating a mediated act in the classroom or something like that, right? So are we, for example,
when we are talking about education as about constructing some reality in the classroom, cookies can interrupt it. So do they belong to the classroom, or is it just breaking the classroom and turning it into something else?
I think again, this is part of the importance of the teacher as well, because of course the bringing of the cookie to the classroom is an intentional act that is artificially creating, or it's affecting this artificial creation that is the classroom, right? So it alters the reality, but then I guess, and I like this question because it sounds so sort of mundane, but at the same time, that is precisely where education comes to act upon, no, over those mundane things. So when you bring in that cookie, it is,
Maybe you can think of it and answer later.
yes, but I mean, yes, it's a good question because then it's not, if you say it's not directly related to the curriculum or to the instruction or to the didactics. So what does it do? I don't know. I'll have to, if it's not something that is intended for the classroom, then I mean it definitely affects it, but I don't know. I wouldn't know how. Yes.
Become part of it, and it develops and unravels, through the actions and interactions with the cookies, etc. So just to reflect, I mean, if that's helpful in terms of, I think, where your question is going, maybe. Okay.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question, or?
Of course, we are still waiting for Patricia to join us, so.
I have a question for Geraldine, because in the last part of your presentation, when you said that teachers, for example, would say, this doesn't let me do this, right? So they're given a form of agency to this technology. And of course, that reminds me of, philosophers of technology that are nowadays thinking about also in this posthuman fashion, how things mediate our relationship of the world. If you could say something more about that agency of machines, that agency of technologies, of softwares, and if there is such thing, or if it's just an attribution that then depends on us, or is it really or sort of what is the reality of this agency of technologies?
I suppose I was looking at it from the point of view of digital fluency and things like digital literacy in the context, because we say, certainly in Ireland and internationally, there's a huge focus on the digital skills of educators, but also kind of preparing our students for the digital environment. And it was really, I was looking at it from the point of view of, okay, is it a thing that the skills that I have in this context enable me to do what I want to do, or is there that agentive nature in terms of the technology? But it's a perception, as you say, we attribute this power to the technologies because we say, well, it won't let me do that, or I can't do that because, but it's a limitation in the context potentially of the skills of the lecturers, rather than the idea that they would not be able to do something. So it's really, I think, giving that agency to technologies that's not necessarily there, but we attribute it to those technologies. And it's almost at a subconscious level, because I know certainly in terms of the interviews I would have had with the lecturers, they were not aware even that they were mindful of kind of saying in these kind of things. They talked about the difficulties that they had with the technology, or I had to learn how to do this and do it lots and lots of times. You know yourselves if you've used technology. But they weren't aware of that sense of empowerment that they were giving, and even the socio-material nature of technology, that didn't come up at all. So for me, it's something to explore and to see in the context of this really huge emphasis on developing digital skills amongst educators. Are we going too far, or maybe we're not going far enough? Are we being maybe not critical enough in the sense of, okay, well, we're enabling or we're allowing technologies to do X, Y, or Z, but we're not mindful or we're not aware of it. So it's really that reflective piece that I was interested in. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, Antonio, but it was really interesting to talk to the lecturers about their digital skills and moving even away from digital literacy to the idea of digital fluency, you know, so that you're not saying, okay, you can press that button and it does X, but here's a suite of tools that will enable you to do different things. And just like being fluent in a language, you'll pull from the different tools to enable you then to do whatever it is you want to do. I don't think we're there yet, but the idea is good in terms of allowing the lecturer that agency to decide. And again, perhaps that's the humanist approach, but at the same time, I do agree, I suppose, that the human is still at the centre of it. And I think what was lovely for me this morning when Carol was talking was to say that we're not getting rid of the human. And I thought that was really useful for me to understand all of it. We're not getting rid of the human, but we're looking at the human in relation to the environment, in relation to the technologies. We're acknowledging the role that the non-human actors have, but we're not saying, okay, as the human teacher in the room, you're not important, everything else is. So,
I just because I've just finished my PhD and I've looked at the movement of things, and I've looked at the movement of a phone within a non-formal learning program. And the program was 4 weeks long in different environments. So one was in a really rural area, then they moved to a more urban area, and actually the agency of the phone was not only affected people and the humans, but actually was affected by the more than human around it. So, for instance, I was looking at relationships and what a phone does in relationships and the learning that emerges from it. So in a rural area where there was no Wi-Fi, the young person's capacity to use the phone and turn to the phone was actually really nullified because there's no Wi-Fi. So it becomes pointless, and you have to turn to the human to have those relationships. Whereas when you're in an urban area with Wi-Fi, actually those human relationships are still important, but you've got a phone that connects you to loads of other people and loads of other support. And so the agency of that thing was affected and effective depending on the entanglement it was in. So I'd really like to talk to you a bit more about what you did, Geraldine.
Yeah, I think what has been really enlightening for me is actually reflecting on that whole kind of interaction with the environment and the impact those non-human things have on our activities and our everyday lives without us actually being mindful or conscious of the importance of that. The phone is a perfect example. Yeah.
First, I like that you're trying to go with multimodality, and we also have some, I think we have some crossroads with you because we recently published the research on visual images on philosophy YouTube videos. And yes, so the ways that how much they actually represent the concept that their speakers are talking about. So which ways do they use to to give some. My question would be, so do you know that actually like one of the ultimate goals of the research like that is to form some kind of a toolkit for teachers, which ways to use, which impacts do these and these ways have on the students? So can you talk about that?
Yeah, just a small matter of PhD to finish first. But the idea is the framework that is there because I suppose just building on Natasha's inquiry graphics, there is a toolkit for the inquiry graphics. Natasha, you can talk about that, I suppose, if you want to. But the idea really is to develop that framework into something that is interactive for a teacher. So I mentioned social justice or climate change. If I want to talk about that, if that's the concept that I want to teach, and I have a video or I have some sort of multimedia artifact, how can I unpack that? How can I deconstruct it? I might just want to focus on the voice as medium of communication, or maybe I want to focus on the visual, but the visual is not just a photograph. It might be all of the other graphic pictorial representations. But this framework will hopefully be a toolkit for teachers to really kind of talk about critical media literacy among students. That's the plan.
One more question. My question is about technology and the technological stack, because actually I don't know what you meant by software affordances, which probably includes that that technological stack. But when you start designing instructional videos, one of the first questions, at least for me, is what formats, what platforms we are going to use, because there is huge difference between whether it's a Creative Commons licensed content or it's a closed platform of your university. And this level, well, it's legal, it's technological at the same time, and actually it changes the modality. I believe that it changes the modality dramatically, because when you open your videos, you use one set of tools. When you close your videos, well, this is kind of message that we are not open. And it influences, in my opinion, it influences the whole paradigm of instructional videos.
Absolutely, and I think, I suppose, even coming back to Natasha's point about the phone affecting and being affected by, we think we operate in an open system. We don't. You know, we are confined. Somebody mentioned the dreaded LMS this morning, and I went, oh goodness. But that's the idea. You know, you have your structures, and I suppose what I didn't mention in the video was the fact that I was looking at critical realism is my ontological kind of background, so I was looking at the idea of coming at knowledge as fallible, coming at things, you know, in terms of how we learn about things and understand things. But again, it's this idea that we're operating within the constructs of particular educational systems and so on, as Carol said this morning, and the technology is sometimes determined for us. So, but it's being aware of that, being aware of the limitations of that. And I don't think we are as critically reflective as we should be in the context of developing the resources for our teachers, because, or for our students. If we're teaching a concept and we're standing at the top of the room, then we are the technology. But that no longer happens, you know, so we have something, whether it's PowerPoint or whatever it is. So we really do have to be aware of that. And even for the students to be critically aware of what messages are being sent or by technology. So that's kind of what we're talking about.
Patricia joined us. So, Patricia, can you hear us? Is everything fine? Can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Hi. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
Patricia and her team are finding floors, cartographies of pedagogical encounters with the posthuman teacher bot. So can you please start? We have like 15 to 20 minutes to finish your presentation.
Yes, can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
No, she cannot hear us.
Can you hear us?
Would you like me to begin my presentation now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I can share screen. Can you see? Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Patricia Gibson, and I'm delighted to be presenting my research here today from Dublin. My project is entitled Finding Floors, Cartographies of Pedagogical Encounters with a Posthuman Teacher Bot. So my research looks at the ways that we understand the automated teacher. And it's quite often understood from a personalized learning approach, which means it's very one-to-one, it's very individualistic. And then that means that knowledge is conceptualized as the transmission. It's almost like a transmissive object that can be sent from person to person. And there are commercial values underpinning this, whereby knowledge creation is valued in terms of how efficient it can be and how scalable it is. So my research question is, what new pedagogical practices might be generated through a posthuman approach to automated teaching? So if we think about automated teaching in a less humanistic way and more of a posthuman, take more of a posthuman approach. So I developed a chatbot to act as a teacher called Flores, the teacher bot. So Flores worked with me to co-teach 22 undergraduate students on an interactive narrative course module at a UK university. So I set about creating a posthuman assemblage. Hereby we looked at sort of an assemblage of entities that Braidotti would call posthuman subject formations, which would constitute the students, Flores the teacher bot, myself as the teacher, the narrative and interactive story itself. So we're looking at, that brings us to new materialism. So we're looking at, sort of non-human entities. And the posthuman assemblage is underpinned with socially just pedagogies. So socially just pedagogies they look at a more sort of equality and ethical and sustainable way of looking at educational practices. So it sort of pushes back against the speed and constant sort of mediations of technology. So Flores the teacher, posthuman teacher bot, is imbued with posthuman values that are draw from Braidotti's posthuman critical theory, and educational values that draw from Biesta's philosophical framework of education. So what happened was we had an assemblage of relational encounters whereby all these entities interacted with each other. So we brought us together to think about, well, what is knowledge? How might it come about? And, what are the alternative ways of representing knowledge? So I conducted a digital ethnography on an interactive course module. So I was the teacher, the coder, and the researcher. And myself and Flores worked to co-teach the students. So the story circle was the educational event whereby the students came together to collectively author a story. So they each had to submit a micro narrative with Flores. So they had to log into the teacher bot. I'll show you in a second. And each of these micro narratives were limited to approximately 100 words. So each of the students published their individual story, but they had to connect it to the previous entry. So for example, this is what the interface looked like. We had Flores, the teacher bot. This is the chat bot here, the area where the student here entered the phrase story circle. And Flores responds with, "Welcome to our story circle. Here is the previous paragraph of the story. Please add to it." Now, this was the story that I inputted to initiate this story circle event. So it was an extract from the Greta Thunberg novel, "No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference." I was so frustrated that nothing was being done, and I felt like I had to do something. To which the student was required to add their story, but they had to add it, they had to come at it from a different aspect, or to think about their story in a different way so that it would connect with the previous entry. So I used a method called cartography to map these pedagogical encounters so that we could surface teaching moments and identify how these pedagogical practices came about, and then to map the effects of these encounters on the student transformations in their understanding around knowledge. So in the findings, the students experienced a collective transformation in understanding around Flora's agental capacity. So the capacity of Flora's algorithms to work and create knowledge and shape knowledge processes. So this came about through a particular point of difference where S1, student S1, emailed me to say it, meaning Flora's, seems to have put my entry backwards. So S1, student 1, inputted their entry and Flora's replayed the entry to them, but it was upside down. So I responded to the student's email by saying, oh, the student said, I'm not sure if it was me that did something. Is there any way I can fix it? So there was this assumption that it's a problem. Flora's has experienced a technical failing. And in actual fact, that was the case, okay? But I replied, myself as Patricia Gibson, as the teacher, unfortunately, in the meantime, there has been another addition to the story. So someone else had come in and added their story. So the order of your story remains as you entered it or slightly mixed up by Flora's. So this is where the students actively encountered, new knowledge systems in terms of, well, the story isn't a fixed linear authored story. Notions of authorship are disrupted here. Notions of Flora's and the automated teacher and the way that Flora's might teach you something has been disrupted here as well. So Bista says the interruptions or intrusions that take place within knowledge creation processes are as instances of teaching that bring about something new. So I would argue that this was an instance of teaching that whereby Flora's brought about something new, or the student really would have brought about something new. Flora's would have given the opportunity for the student to encounter these new knowledge systems. So here are some of the student responses to this Flora's agental capacity, whereby it mixed up their respective stories. S3 says, I was amazed too that Flora's was capable of changing the narrative. S12 said, it allowed me to see how chatbots work and can have their own minds sometimes. S13 said, I did not expect Flora's to co-write the story along with us. And S14, I too was unaware that Flora's would also be one of our co-authors. So that's what I mean by the students experiencing a collective transformation around what constitutes knowledge and how it might be created. So in terms of what constitutes knowledge is this idea of, the knowledge isn't the fixed entity of the story. It's actually taking place through interactions and relational encounters. So post-human critical theory helps to think about Flora's as an equal entity with the capacity to shape teaching practices. So Bista's philosophy of teaching, there are three concepts: responsibility without knowledge, transcendental violence, and trust without ground. So responsibility without knowledge is where Bista says that it's responsibility, the teacher's responsibility for the subjectivity of the student that is bestowed on teachers, despite the difficult character of educational relationships. So this sort of responsibility cannot be predetermined because it's impossible to know what the teacher might be responsible for. And then this idea around transcendental violence is what it describes how the teachers must persist in creating disturbances that provide opportunities for students to come into presence. Here, knowledge knowledge creation is conceptualized as a reaction to this disturbance or these disturbances. And Bista argues in terms of trust without ground that education only begins when the student is willing to take a risk. Henceforth, the risk has the potential to be transformative. And that's where the student transformations take place. So news teaching relationships were identified here that helped bring about these student transformations. And based on Bista's theory, I sort of termed the teaching relationships as, the performance as an obligation of radical hope, conducting disturbances, and fostering trust and the pursuit of risk. So in terms of the first one, an obligation of radical hope, this came about through the disruption of the notion of the story as a static object. So Flores would have been part of this sort of teaching obligation here, and the student was no longer conceived as a fixed entity predetermined to act in a particular way. And in terms of conducting disturbances, it moves beyond thinking about knowledge as an object that can be required, and more towards a subjective approach where knowledge creation is actively emergent through the responses to these disturbances. And some of the responses to the disturbances. So S17 said, I followed the previous story and tried to create a consistent flow. However, I tried to change the dynamic by adding a character, as this will help people to understand from another perspective. So the student here is responding to these disturbances. And Beast argues that teachers should not simply accept responses that are self-expressionistic, but must instead persist in confronting the students to respond to who and what is other. So we're trying to get away from this individualistic, personalized learning approach to a more collective, individuated approach. So we can see here S14 responding to the remixing of the story. I feel my narrative was slightly underrepresented in terms of what it means and the seriousness of its topic. Flores began telling my narrative, which is about a sexual assault story, and then started talking about playing games. It then came back to the topic of suicide, which did bring the serious and relatable element back. So the student is responding here to Flores mixing up their story, and sort of the student is being taught by Flores to sort of not have quite a sort of a self-expressionist view to the story. And then S14 continues by saying, by Flores creating a small open paragraphs, it made the transitions a lot easier and more exciting. So Flores is teaching the student to sort of overturn some of these negative responses. So fostering trust in the pursuit of risk. So here, Flores work to foster truth and encourage students to pursue risk, and through technical feelings, or we could say technical feelings, where the algorithmic workings exemplified the weakness that is necessary for good education. So for instance, these mechanistic approaches embody a strong, secure, predictable, and risk-free approach to teaching that reinforces oppositional binaries of either total control or total freedom. Now, both posthuman critical theory would be doesn't create these oppositional binaries, but works to think about all entities as equal. So therefore, it fosters a more sustainable teaching approach that is slow, it's difficult, it's frustrating, it's weak, and the outcomes can't be predetermined. So Flores' algorithmic mix-ups, technical weaknesses, all worked here to teach the students and to bring about something new. So again, when Flores remixed the story, I, as the human teacher, did not seek to fix all these weak technical errors. So we see here the human teacher and the automated teacher working together. So Flores remained largely free from the restraints and precision and, this abhorrence of error. And we were both free to teach in a more educational way rather than a commercially valued way. So here we have quite a large response from S5 in the blog around, this sort of transformation towards a more relational approach at creating knowledge. So, the story before mine was about D&D and a group of friends. I felt, I related my micro story to this by stating what the event was, and then it related to my own IDoc. So I feel my story added to the existing story quite well because I was able to continue. So we can see here where the student is thinking about their story in terms of other entities and, beyond themselves, an individualistic and self-expressionistic approach. In terms of fostering trust in the pursuit of risk, one student said, it made me think a lot about how things flow and how this is a massive part of the narrative structure I need to be considering. So again, the educational aims around, interactive narrative, closure, authorship, linearity, all those things. So S5 says, hi, Patricia, I just submitted my story into the bot now, that meaning Flores. And when it came back, a jumble of words from the story, and I'm not sure if it's uploaded or not. I also tried typing submit at the end of it. So this is where the student is expressing sort of a lack of trust in the technology to submit their, in terms of they're not sure if their assessment, because this was an assessment event, they're not sure if it's actually being submitted. And they're sort of looking for some sort of confirmation around that, even though the story was inputted into Flores algorithms. They, by virtue of not clicking an actual submit button, that created that sort of that sense of risk and that lack of trust. But interestingly, S5 figures a way around this technical bug that shapes Flores' algorithmic workings by saying, I started the reflection again in the same session, and then I just said next. This was a different technical failing whereby they were trying to input responses and Flores, had another sort of technical bug. So we see the students become active subjects here rather than, sort of passive objects where they're trying to work to think, well, how can I do something about this? So S5 engages with the risk of education, takes responsibility as an active subject by actually shaping the knowledge creation process. The educational aims around qualification, which is one of Beast's sort of teaching philosophy, is to understand the concepts of interactive narrative. And these were the educational aims. To understand authorship, closure, non-linearity in terms of interactive narrative. So by virtue of Flores disrupting those notions of authorship, the students actively encountered and engaged and experienced this. Their story lacked closure and it lacked a linear sort of structure. Flores helped to teach the students these concepts because when the students asked to access the whole story, Flores algorithms were coded to tell the story in a serialized form. So they didn't get the whole story in one go, but just serialized forms, and they had to click next to get some more of it. So there, Flores, the story, and the students became inextricably linked. So the story itself became sort of a material entity with agential capacity and the capacity to act in its own right. So the student logged into Flores to access the story, and then the Flores was the Flores and the story and the student became sort of inextricably linked. So I argue that this retelling the story illuminates a new materialistic conception of knowledge creation in terms of relational capacity, where thinking, Braidotti argues, thinking is conceived as the ability to enter modes of relation. So I would argue that Flores and myself brought about and the students brought about that teaching moment where new materialistic conceptions of knowledge were encountered. So here we see S5 express knowledge creation as a relational encounter and understanding around that. So well done to the person who went before me for leaving the story very open-ended. It made my experience a lot easier and allowed me to be flexible in how I wanted my story to play out. I also tried to do this for the person after me by finishing my story with a question which needed answered. Here we see S19 state, I find that the current topic made it quite difficult to integrate my micro-narrative. I like your idea of allocating days to each student. This was the students discussing on the blog how they might sort of go about working with Flores in new and alternative ways and discussing this. So again, being active subjects. So here we see a critical approach to knowledge creation where S1 says, and when you look at the full story, it is difficult to follow and there isn't a traditional beginning, middle and end. But maybe you don't need that for a story to be interesting. Maybe what is interesting about our story is the multiple shifts in narrative. And there's that question, around this provocative sort of approach. So I'm going to end now with sort of some suggested features to guide the future of automated teaching and features, sort of rather than specific sort of, principles as such. Because this research is very contextualized, obviously, and contingent. So, I would suggest two features. to guide the future of automated teaching, one being relational co-teaching and educational values. So in terms of relational co-teaching, floors as a posthuman subject became conceptualized as an equal entity that worked collectively with the students to create knowledge. So a question I would pose to teachers working with automated teaching: how can your automated educational activities be more collaborative rather than individualistic? And then in terms of educational values and bringing that to automated teaching events, I use the concepts of qualification and subjectification from BEAST's framework to define the aims of the automated teaching event so that they weren't commercially valued. And so a question I would pose to human teachers is, what are the educational aims of your automated teaching event or activity? So in conclusion, I would argue that the significance of this research is a contribution to understandings around the pedagogical value in conceptualizing automated teaching from a posthuman perspective. And we have some references there at the end. So thank you so much for your time. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here.